Hello. Today we're going to be talking about microeconomic tools to create a greener economy. I know a lot of you not very enthusiastic about economics, but one of the key things I want you to get from this course that this is some knowledge of economics is essential, and economics really is unavoidable if you want to create a more sustainable society. Normally, an intro course on environment and society will spend a lot of time talking about the philosophical differences between preservationists and conservationists. I don't do that because I'd rather give you the tools to make a difference in the future. And I think understanding the different choices provided by economics is really important if you want to be a difference maker. I won't read this definition. You can read it. All the slides are stored so that you can look at them more slowly. Um, if you're not sure what microeconomics is about, I encourage you to read this definition. Now, in terms of microeconomic tools or policies, um, what we're trying to do is figure out how to alter behavior in the marketplace. Generally, most economists would agree you want to leave the marketplace alone. You want to allow the marketplace to do its thing. Um, but last time we talked about negative externalities. And first of all, there are many negative externalities in the marketplace that need to be addressed. Some people call climate change the mother of all negative externalities. And if society believes it's important to shift the balance away from one type of technology towards another, we have a bunch of tools to do this. Um, We're going to be talking in terms of incentives and penalties, often referred to as carrots and sticks. The idea of the carrot and stick approach, motivation, comes from the early industrial period. It's something that was put forward by the philosopher Jeremy Bentham. We'll be talking about different carrots and sticks that we can use to help create a greener economy. One of the things we're going to do in this lecture, I mean, you could do, again, more than a semester on this topic. We're going to narrow things down a lot, be very simplistic. And I'm going to specifically focus on how do we decarbonize our energy sector and look for examples and try to give you an idea of how these types of tools can work, giving examples from this one specific area. But keep in mind that there are other tools, and there are many other tools even that you could apply to decarbonizing the energy sector. I just want to give you a taste for what's possible, and a lot of these can be applied to other areas of the economy. Okay, I want you to take a second now to pause this video and think about an imaginary scenario where um, you graduate and you're brought into the White House as an advisor to whoever is president, and this person is serious about getting carbon out of our economy, wants to begin with the energy sector. I want you to pause the video and write down some ideas. What do you think would be the best way to get carbon out of the economy? Pause the video for a while, take some notes, and then come back. Okay, so in terms of going through some of the options, I'm going to start with the sticks, um, the way that you cajole actors. So when Bentham talked about the carrot and the stick, it was the idea of leading a donkey first by putting a carrot in front of its face and then cajoling it from behind with a stick. So these are the sticks. We can talk about a carbon tax. For those of you who've not familiar with taxes, a carbon tax is a type of Pigouvian tax, like a sin tax. It's the idea that you want to use taxes as a way to discourage negative things that you want less of. Um, Another example would be a carbon tax is really a type of pollution tax. Germany used pollution taxes heavily when East and West Germany were reunified in the 1990s. There were huge reunification costs, and rather than hit people with an increase on taxes on things like wages and things they purchased, Germany decided to do this, raise the necessary money by posing pollution taxes on industry. And the results from that were overwhelming. If you put a tax on industry for pollution, pretty soon you'll find that your revenues go down because industry starts polluting a lot less. They develop new ways of doing things, they innovate in terms of technology, and in the short term, Germany succeeded not only in raising revenue, but also abating a lot of its pollution. Cap and trade. The US actually invented cap and trade. We'll talk more about that, but in our attempts during the early 1990s, late 80s, under the George Bush administration, um, we had a problem of acid rain, and cap and trade was put forward as a free market conservative tool to address the problem of sulfur dioxide emissions. And it was a very successful tool, so people naturally thought we could apply this to carbon dioxide. Command and control. Command and control is when the government just regulates. It says that you can't do something, you have to use a certain technology. The Clean Air Act is an example of command and control regulation. And we'll talk about some of the weaknesses of this in a moment, and why, of the top three, this is the least best option. The fourth thing we'll talk about is setting efficiency standards for things like cars and major appliances like refrigerators and HVAC systems. Okay, let's start out with the carbon tax. There are two competing design ideas that have gained popularity in the US. The first is the idea to make the tax revenue neutral. The idea of a revenue neutral tax would be whatever money you're raising through the carbon tax, you would offset it by lowering taxes on other things, especially things you want to have more of, like investment. So you would find ways to decrease revenues, for example, cut taxes on companies that are investing in more R&D. Part of the appeal of this is that many conservatives, especially conservative economists, find this to be a very appealing option. State of Washington has tried twice to pass a carbon tax through a ballot initiative. The first time it failed by like 59 to 41%. It didn't please the left or the right. It was going to raise a little bit of revenue for things that are listed here below, and we'll talk more about, not a lot, which is why this displeased the left. The right, of course, doesn't like taxes. Then 2 years later, they did a rerun. It didn't do much better. It got 43% of the vote this time. This time they tried making it revenue neutral to appeal to more folks that are right of center. So it did do a little bit better. It still didn't pass. But the logic is that a revenue neutral tax would have a much greater chance of ever getting approved by the US Congress than one that raises revenue. But let's look at the second option now, where government actually creates new revenue. And people who are left of center often find this very appealing because you could use the money to do three basic things. One is many people are weary of the energy transition because they think it might hurt low-income people by making energy more expensive. You can use money from a carbon tax, and California has done this in a slightly different way. They have a surcharge on electricity, which actually they've invested in these three categories. California's had a very aggressive program now for quite a while of making low-income housing much more energy efficient to protect people from having high electric bills. So it's one thing you can do with the revenue. You can also take that revenue and invest it in public transportation or more high voltage lines from the Great Plains to major load centers. These are places like Chicago that use a lot of electricity. Um, Europe's been doing this for a while. They don't call carbon tax, but if you've ever bought gasoline or your parents have bought gasoline in Europe, you know that the prices are often 3 and 4 times higher than the US. This is because they have a whopping gas tax. And in many countries, especially in Western Europe, a lot of that gas tax money has gone into helping to pay for the amazing public transportation infrastructure they have. So that's another option. A third option would be to put a lot of money into R&D, research and development, in areas where innovation is still needed. That could include like longer term energy storage, finding ways that ships and planes could run on clean energy, and ways to decarbonize really stubborn industrial processes, in particular, how we make cement and steel. Um, so this is why a lot of people who are left of center consider a revenue-based carbon tax to be very appealing. But again, given the realities of the United States, this is probably unlikely, either option to the near term, and the more likely option, if it were to happen, would be the first. And I want to talk now about second option, and I want to also bring this up from the perspective of the Obama administration. The Obama administration came into office in 2008, committed to do something about climate change. They felt from conversations with Republicans that a carbon tax was off the table. It was never going to get through Congress, especially the Senate, in 2009. So instead, they thought they would pursue a cap and trade policy because A, this had been popular with some Republicans in the not so distant future, distant past, I mean, people like John McCain, Lindsey Graham had supported cap and trade. Cap and trade was actually seen as a Republican policy. It was developed by the right-wing leaning Heritage Foundation. Um, it was championed by President George H.W. Bush. It was the key component to his amendments to the Clean Air Act. And it did a very successful job of lowering sulfur emissions in the US, dealing with our acid precipitation problems. So Obama thought that if he went into the Republican playbook, he would find enough Republicans to pass such a policy. Let me quickly say that unfortunately, the fossil fuel interests, particularly the Koch brothers and their Americans for Prosperity group that they fund, uh, made this impossible by labeling this, framing it as cap and tax, and making it very difficult for any Republican to support it. Of course, it's not only what they were doing in terms of branding, but there was always the threat they would use their deep pockets, for Republicans supported this, to run an opponent against that individual in the Republican primary. And that, given their deep pockets, that was a very intimidating threat. So cap and trade didn't succeed. Let me explain what cap and trade is now. It's where you set a cap on how much pollution is permissible. So let's say if we were looking at the energy generation sector, we would determine how much carbon dioxide emission could come from power plants, natural gas and coal power plants. We would set the cap either at what it is now or even lower, and then companies would have to buy permits. Free market economists like cap and trade, people who want the free market to play more of a role, like cap and trade, because companies that, for example, have less investment in coal or have excellent renewable energy assets like a utility in Arizona that could develop solar, will find it very easy to switch from fossil fuels to clean energy, and then can supplement what they're doing by selling the permits then to, let's say, a utility in the Ohio River Basin that's heavily invested in coal. It has a lot of infrastructure in coal, can't as easily move away from coal into clean energy. So over time, you can lower the cap by retiring permits. In some cap and trade markets, NGOs like environmental groups could compete to buy up some of the permits. Um, it's deemed to be a fairly efficient, effective system. But again, this, at least at the national level, was a policy up till now we've decided not to pursue. There are some smaller cap and trade systems operating in the United States and the Northeast, in California. In Canada, you have an area also, of all places actually, major oil producing state in Canada has a pretty strong policy, or at least on paper, a strong policy against carbon emissions. All right. Whoops. Have to switch those slides around. So the third approach, and this is what the Obama administration picked, it's the least efficient, but it was the only choice they had because Congress wasn't going to support their efforts to do something about climate change in any way. Now, the Obama administration used the power that was given to the executive branch under the Clean Air Act to declare CO2 a pollutant. This was challenged in court, but the Supreme Court in a 5-4 ruling upheld this move. This became the foundation of the Clean Power Plant, which President Trump has gutted, but maybe it will be brought back in some form in the future. But this is an example of the command and control approach. It is less efficient than a carbon tax or cap and trade because it encourages less innovation. There are many things that are wrong with the command and control approach compared to more free market approaches. But on Obama's behalf, not only did he have no other options, but this is a very interesting command and control piece of regulation. It avoids some of the downsides of command and control. For example, one size fits all. There's an understanding there that some states, so the Clean Power Plan was imposed on states. And some states that were heavily dependent on coal, for example, were treated differently than some states that could easily and were already making the switch to renewables. So the good thing about this was that it was much more flexible than command and control regulations of the past. Okay, another thing that can be done is you can regulate the grid and require more carbon-free energy. An example of this are renewable energy portfolio standards, or known as REPs, that are passed by states. 29 states and the District of Columbia have passed the REPs. North Carolina has one. It's one of the weakest in that it's just 12.5% by 2021. But North Carolina still stands out because it's the only state in the region with the REPs. And because in part we had a REPs, the renewable energy development companies, especially in the solar space, grew up in North Carolina where there was fertile soil and have become active now in other southern states as the economics of renewable energy have changed, where big incentives are no longer needed. I do want to point out that 14 states have very strong REPs, where they pledge to be 50% greater renewables. And 2 states, Hawaii and California, have declared that they'll be 100% renewable by 2045. Efficiency standards are the final tool that I want to look at from a stick perspective. They set standards for efficiency, for example, cars. Um, Congress created the corporate average fuel efficiency. You'll always hear it referred to as CAFE standards with the Energy Policy and Conservation Act of 1975. This is a power mostly reserved for the federal government, but when the standard was established in 1975, California, which had already been doing this, was grandfathered in and allowed to establish its own standards as long as they were stricter than the federal standards. And states are allowed to choose between the California or the national standard. Now, I only mention this because there's an epic court battle brewing. President Trump has rolled back CAFE standards that were set during the Obama era. And California, that's refused to accept this rollback and is abiding by its own standards. President Trump has stripped away, or supposedly stripped away, their ability. California is going to court and arguing that he doesn't have the power to do this because this was an ability granted to them by Congress, so the executive branch has no power to take that away. We'll see what happens in the court system, but this is going to be a long, ugly battle. Other things the federal and local and state governments can do is they can set efficiency standards for public buildings. For example, in the past, we never took a life cycle perspective. There are buildings at the University of North Carolina that are more than 200 years old, and 50 years is an average lifespan for a public building. And the way that buildings were done in the past was they would be decided on what the building needed to do, what its function was, and then bids would be opened up, and government, in order to avoid corruption, was obligated to take the lowest bid. Well, you can imagine the lowest bid is not going to invest in things like energy efficiency, for example, better insulation for the building, better fittings. It's going to build the cheapest thing it can get away with. Unfortunately, then the taxpayers are on the hook to operate that building for the next 50 years. Government now is increasingly beginning to take more of a life cycle perspective on these buildings, and many states have minimum requirements, often like silver leads standards for what a public building has to be. And this is important because it helps drive the industry. When you're doing the right thing, you're using the right kind of supplies, for example, advanced windows, and using other high performance building technologies, helping to build a supply chain. You're helping companies that are in the green building space scale, just helping to push their costs down so they can apply these tools and principles to buildings in the private sector. The federal government can also set standards if it wants to for buildings in the private sector. The most notable example of this is California with its zero net energy buildings plan. California is requiring first residential, as a matter of fact, from this year on, and commercial buildings by 2030 to be zero net energy buildings. And the federal government in California have set standards for major energy using appliances like HVAC systems and refrigerators. So these are things that can always be ratcheted up. Industry tends to scream about it, but they always figure it out. And unlike the prediction of prices that consumers won't be able to afford, somehow they always figure it out and prices don't really go up. Refrigerators are a great example. When California took the lead on imposing efficiency standards on refrigerators in the 1970s, most people had a refrigerator that was like the third of the size of today's refrigerator. And industry screamed that they were going to have to shrink the size of the refrigerator and consumers were going to pay out the nose. And today refrigerators are much bigger, use a lot less energy, and are a lot cheaper than they were back then. All right, I want to talk about some important carrots to use in altering the energy landscape. 4 we'll look at are subsidies, accelerating the speed of innovation, um, procurement policies, and deregulation of the energy sector. Just a quote from the movie The Martian. If you haven't seen it, the main character um, is called Mark Watney, and Mark Watney says, in the face of overwhelming odds, he's been stranded on Mars. I'm left with one option. I'm going to have to science the shit out of this. And in many ways, the predicament we're in today on Earth, um, we're going to have to do a heck of a lot of innovating if we're going to create a decent standard of living for everybody on the planet without destroying the environment. First thing I want to talk about are subsidies. We'll look at some of the advantages and disadvantages of subsidies. I also want to give some examples of subsidies like tax credits to enable new industries or encourage early adopters, feed-in tariffs, R&D expenditures, direct investment in new companies and desired niches. Government can do this with loans or grants, right? So I want to first get into some of the negatives of subsidies. So the only way to really justify subsidies is that you want to create a new industry. It may be entirely new, or you might just want to create a new industry because you think that's industry is important. It exists somewhere else in the world, but you think that in order to maintain there are benefits to your society, either in terms of national security or good paying jobs, that you need to be involved in that industry. So the infant industry argument is one of the main reasons to have subsidies. Economists generally loathe subsidies because they distort the marketplace. And as many economists would point out, those little babies, when they grow up, become strong and don't want to let go of their subsidies. And a good example to support this argument is our subsidies in the energy space. If you look at even today where most of the subsidies go, they're going to fossil fuels. And there's no way to rationalize that under the infant industry argument, because fossil fuel companies are the very definition of a mature industry. But today, disproportionate amount of energy subsidies go to fossil fuels. The second highest recipient over time has been nuclear. Within the renewable energy sector, biofuels, because it's supported by farmers, have received a much bigger chunk than other types of renewables. And often it's been the bulk of the biofuel subsidy has gone to corn-based ethanol, which most independent observers would agree is not a very good option for society to be pursuing, because it's not efficient. You basically have to put almost as much energy into it, the process, as you get out of it. Not to mention that it takes food out of the food supply chain. On the other hand, not all subsidies are bad. The German feed-in tariff is a brilliant subsidy. You'll be watching a video later. You'll be learning more about it, but you can refer back to this chart. Basically, the subsidy was created with obsolescence in mind, that its goal was to drive down the price of renewable energy, and it was expected to do so over time. So over time, the subsidy basically phases out until it gets to a market price. And that's exactly what's happened. And the German feed-in tariff, not just because it was instituted in Germany, but because over 20 countries copied it, created a large market for windmills, solar panels. It allowed for intense competition to begin to take place. It really drove down the price of these technologies and allowed them to scale much faster on their own than if the market had been allowed to proceed at and it's even hard to talk about a natural progression because of all the fossil fuel subsidies that exist not just in the US, but all around the world. So a little nudge was really important to get renewables off the ground. If you look at how expensive renewables were before the German feed-in tariff, especially the second iteration that happened in 2000, the German Renewable Energy Act, the only reason you would ever put up renewables is because you were altruistic. Maybe there was some incredible tax credit scheme somewhere, or you were in a really remote area and something like solar is the only way you were going to get electricity because there was no way you were going to connect to the grid. But these feed-in tariffs really push the price of renewables down. You'll learn more about it in the video you'll be watching. You can see what's happened, and this only goes to 2014, and prices have continued to come down. These are the price of this is the price of a solar watt, includes built-in cost of the inverter, solar panels, the wiring. Um, Today, in many places, solar is the cheapest option available to produce electricity. In a lot of the United States today, new solar is cheaper than an existing coal plant. So building a solar plant is cheaper than buying coal from coal mines. And you need to understand that if you want to know why coal is in trouble and why our president has not been able to bring coal back. It's just no longer able to compete. You can see how market forces have been driving the rise of solar, but important again is the role that policy played, especially in Germany and those countries that follow Germany's lead. Um, Many companies developed in Germany around the feed-in tariff, and then in Asia, especially China, also to some degree South Korea, saw that this was an important industry of the future. China scaled this industry up in an incredible way. Some people would argue unfairly that they priced people out of the market by subsidizing it like crazy. So they were able to sell solar panels and other equipment below cost. In Germany, this put a lot of German companies out of business, but on the flip side, China's been able to supply the world with incredibly cheap products for solar, especially the panels. They also have really high quality, cheap inverters. Same thing happened with wind, although well, the feed-in tariffs played an important role. The production tax credit in the U.S. was also helpful. It wasn't as important as the feed-in tariff, in part because we had this stop-and-go policy on the production tax credit for wind. It would exist for a few years, then it would go away for a few years. So it's much harder to build a new industry when there's a unreliable landscape as existed in the US compared to Germany, where there was really clear-cut transparency. That's why wind really took off in Europe first. Other countries that were heavily pushing wind with subsidies were Denmark, Spain, later Great Britain. Right. I want to talk now about accelerating the speed of innovation. There are a few ways that we can do this. Government can subsidize research and development, and the US tends to do that by giving money to universities. Some people don't see the need for government to be involved in research, but actually government plays a critical role in research. First of all, basic research. Private sector is never going to fund basic research. It's a losing proposition. Can take decades for basic research to turn into products. And in a world where quarterly reports move stock prices up and down, no CEO is going to allow for large chunk of money to be diverted to basic science. The one exception to this historically was Bell Labs in the United States, but Bell Labs could afford to do this and was obligated because it had a monopoly, and part of its role as having a telephone monopoly was to continue to advance technology. So it had an obligation to invest a lot in science. A lot of companies don't even invest a lot in applied science. We'll talk more about corporate models and how even in countries, the time perspective can vary, but I'll leave it for now that in the US, most corporations don't think long term. 3 years is considered long term. 2 years is about as far as they'll think in the future when it comes to uh, making investments in sustainability or even investments in new products. They only make investments when they think there's a speedy way to get something to market. And a country is going to fall behind, and we can talk more about this in class, if it does not maintain a larger investment in R&D, not only in basic science, but also applied science. In many countries, this is done in collaboration between government and the private sector when it comes to applied science. In the US, there's a gaping hole. You can use tax incentives also for greater private sector R&D to make maybe companies a little bolder. You can encourage them to invest more in research by allowing them to write that off their taxes. But right now, there are many ways for companies to pay close to zero tax. So you'd have to tighten that up before this could be effective. You can fund public-private partnerships. Um, in many countries, there are many tools to do this. Research institutes, for example, that bring the public and the private sector together, that act as a connector between universities and private industry, where small and mid-sized enterprises can bring research questions that they can't tackle internally and pay a modest amount of money to researchers who earn part of their salary from the government. There are many ways that you can do public-private partnerships to accelerate innovation. Investments in focused research institutions. Most countries have a lot of research institutions. The US has some World War II legacy institutes in energy. One is located across the border in Tennessee, Oak Ridge National Labs. But a lot of these are located far away from major population centers or universities. In other countries, they're often put next to major research universities as a way of creating clusters around the area that the institution deals with. So the idea is a cluster attracts lots of companies, including large and startup companies, because they're creating talent and many other reasons to be located there. In the US, there are energy institutions, again, they're legacies from World War II. They're not bad, but they're certainly not world leading. The one place that we do have institutes that are world leading is in the area of health. The National Institute of Health is considered to be one of the biggest innovation drivers in the world, especially in its field. It would be wise to look at that and replicate that model in other areas of the economy. The reason we don't do that, and that's actually was my last point, is we're really the only high-income country in the world without an industrial policy. And many people on the left and the right, and on the right, Senator Marco Rubio has been writing a lot about this, how we cannot expect to continue to compete globally unless we develop some form of industrial policy. So this may change in the US, and if we do ever develop an industrial policy, you can expect research institutions to probably become more prevalent. Research institutions have some advantages over academia because they often, the private sector is often more closely involved. And again, people are very focused. They don't have teaching obligations. And often you have various types of employees, especially in some countries, you'll have employees who are incentivized to get innovations out and into the private sector rather than, for example, simply publish in prestigious journals. Um, that brings me to the point I've already been talking about this. We need to create incentives for more collaboration between universities and the private sector. Right now, not many university faculty are incentivized to do that. You advance your career by doing basic research and publishing in top journals in your field. Helping a company tackle an important issue that might be relevant to keep that industry competitive in the US doesn't result in that kind of high level publication. And without an incentive structure to kind of build this bridge, innovation is not going to speed up in the US. And final thing I want to mention is that we could do more to support small businesses and startups. Everything from financial help to the creation of more incubator space, especially where um, there seems to be promise of building a cluster. US does some things very well in terms of supporting small business, but we could do a lot more to help drive a strong startup economy. And I'll just mention one thing about startups. A few years ago, Carl Schramm, former president of the Marion Kaufman Foundation, was here on campus and he gave a speech. And the Marion Kaufman Foundation was founded as part of legacy by deceased multimillionaire Marion Kaufman left part of his money to support entrepreneurship. And the Marion Kaufman Foundation has done a study that showed from 1980 to 2015, 80% of the new jobs created in the US been created in companies that are less than 5 years of age. And it seems a little crazy, but when you think about it, new companies that are scaling are adding employees very fast. If you think about old legacy companies, they're always trying to figure out how to do more with less. So the really important in terms of creating good jobs for the future is investing more in innovation. And often the innovation comes from new companies that are willing to take bigger risks, that are trying to reinvent how things are done. And that's often an important part of their DNA and their business model. So small companies are often where innovation comes from. And this is not to knock large companies. Large companies understand this. And that's why most large companies, rather than invest a lot internally in research, have been investing in venture capital funds so they can go and find companies, these new young companies that are creating technology, and buy them up and absorb them. So that's one way for large companies to do innovation. Yeah, I've talked a little bit about the power of the federal government to set an important example through, for example, building standards, but also procurement policies. What the government decides to buy. For example, does it buy for its fleet? Does it buy for the post office Jeeps that run on electric power? The government, for example, if it wanted to support energy storage and the evolution of microgrids, could require all federal buildings to have battery-powered microgrids. And the argument would be this would keep them up and running when the grid goes down. And this would be a really good way to incentivize the evolution of the energy storage space in the US by creating a large market. Also, a movement towards microgrids and zero net energy buildings would be nurtured that way. So procurement policy, government spends an enormous amount of money. Even things like in the past, I remember one time as a student, we petitioned the Chapel Hill Town Council. This is when recycling was becoming big, to only use paper that was made from recycled content. So again, it's a small thing, but having governments buy recycled paper helps stimulate the development of an industry in the US that produces recycled paper. So government through procurement has a lot of power. The military has been looking at alternative fuels, everything from biofuels for its ships to using solar instead of having to truck in diesel across dangerous supply lines. So that can be a big, what's interesting about the military is it's been looking at new solar technologies because it can't, panels are pretty clumsy to lug around. You need something that you can roll up. They've been a big booster of thin film solar. A final one I want to mention is deregulation of the energy sector. Given the already low prices for renewable energy, often when you take away things like the regulated market, where you have legacy utility companies like Duke Energy that have spent a lot of money on coal power plants, they want to use those because so that can impede the movement towards clean energy. But if you have a free market for energy like exists in Texas, given where the prices are for renewables now and how they're continuing to drop so fast, renewables will quickly knock fossil fuels out of the market. And this, deregulation would be very good for especially the Southeast, where most states are like South Carolina, they have no reps, or are like North Carolina that has a very weak reps. So you could debate which is going to get to 100% renewables faster, Texas or California, but in the Southeast where we're not moving very fast, deregulated energy market, something that should appeal to conservatives, would be one of the fastest ways to green our grid. Okay, I want you to watch this video on Germany's renewable energy program. Hopefully it will impress you with what microeconomic policies can do. Again, this changed the world landscape when it comes to energy. This was really an important policy that not only affected Germany, but as I've argued, the entire world. And here, please read these questions and be ready to discuss them tomorrow. Thank you very much for your attention.